once he walked into the White House and made it clear that he wasn't going to shut down the Biden pipeline. It was his war. But certainly now it's his war. I don't think that Trump understands here, or in the case of Iran, once you jump into one of these wars, it becomes your war, and it's exceedingly difficult to get out. Biden, to his credit, went to enormous lengths not to get into a war in Iran. The Israelis tried to bait us into a war against Iran in 2024 on two separate occasions. And the Biden administration smartly did not take the bite, or take the bait, rather. What's happened here with Trump, and this goes back to the 12-day war, is he took the bait, and on June 22nd, he jumped in. So we're now committed to that war against Iran. And I think Trump thought it was a one and done. I think he just thought he'd go in there, we'd pound the Iranians on June 22nd, and that would be the end of the story. But I don't think that's the way that one's going to end. And I think the same thing is true here. He's jumped in with both feet now. If anything, right, there's no end in sight here. Does he really believe that this one's going to end in 50 days? In 50 days, he's going to give Putin an ultimatum. Putin is going to throw up his hands. He's going to surrender. We're going to have a deal. It's going to be a deal that's favorable to the United States, and we live happily ever after. You really think that's going to happen? I don't think that's going to happen. I think this war is going to go on. And I think the Russians are eventually going to win it. And when they win it, we're going to be in a poisonous political environment afterwards. We're going to have a frozen conflict where both sides loathe each other, where both sides go to great lengths to undermine each other's position, the Russians undermining our position in the West, and we trying to undermine his position inside those territories he's conquered in Ukraine. And then there are all sorts of other potential flashpoints in Eastern Europe that are superimposed on this conflict. Endless trouble is ahead for us, endless trouble. This one is not going to end, and it's a pipe dream for Trump to think that in 50 days, he's going to have a magical solution.
Do you have any sense as to why 50? Where did that number come from?
Who knows? I mean, with him, as you know, he just pulls these numbers out of his.
Right. His aides may not have even known. Maybe it's a pretty fair question.
Well, he operates by intuition. As you know, he probably just decided 50 days is, reasonable time frame.
Yeah, I think that's probably the closest expectation. I want to pivot a little bit to the Russian aspect of this. There was an interview given yesterday, and it was published on the Russian media, where Putin was addressing a couple of things here. I'm going to show you two clips from that, but I'm overall kind of curious as to your thought about what is the bigger message he's trying to send, and why did he choose now to make these statements? First of all, he's talking about when he first became president. He actually admits that he was inexperienced when he first entered office and that he trusted the West too much.
On the one hand, the communist regime, and many considered it a de facto tyranny, and on the other hand, the democratic world led by the United States. And many thought so, including me. Oddly enough, I worked for so many years, almost 20 years, in the intelligence of the Soviet Union. I also thought so, that the main contradiction was of an ideological nature. But when the Soviet Union was no more, there was no communist regime, but the cavalier attitude towards the state strategic interests of the Russian Federation remained. Not just a cavalier attitude, but all of this was tied to an obvious desire to achieve some geopolitical advantages. Moreover, when I became president, I also did not immediately understand everything. I began to convey to my colleagues, look, you say this, but you do this, and here is the evidence. And I presented this evidence. They nodded to me and said, yes, 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 everything, of course, we will now restore order and nothing. And everything is exactly the opposite.
So what do you make of that first comment?
I think there's no question that if you look at how the Clinton administration dealt with Boris Yeltsin, who was the Russian president in the 90s, it's very clear that the Clinton administration went to great lengths to accommodate the Russians and not to pick a fight at all with the Russians. There was the big battle over NATO expansion, and we in effect started to shove NATO expansion down the Russians' throat in the 1990s. Remember, Clinton made the decision in 94, and then the first tranche of expansion was in 99. But nevertheless, if you go back and read the documents, and the documents are now available, it's quite clear that the Clinton administration was committed to having good relations with the Russians. They did not want to antagonize the Russians at all. Of course, in late 99, Putin is appointed as Yeltsin's successor. And then in 2000, the Clinton administration goes away and George W. Bush comes into power. If you look at Russian-US relations from roughly 2000 up to the present, or 2000 up to 2014. 2014 is the year when the Ukraine crisis broke out. The Russians constantly complained that we were not treating them fairly, that we were not paying serious attention to their security concerns. And Putin himself gave a very important speech at the 2007 Munich Security Conference, where he laid this unhappiness out before Western leaders. But nevertheless, the West basically ignored his concerns. There's just no question about it. And I personally think that Putin waited too long in terms of trusting the West. A good realist like me would have understood what the West was up to long before 2014. But Putin was remarkably trustworthy. And you want to remember that he seriously engaged in negotiations with the West with regard to the Donbass. He thought that, negotiations could be used to shut down that civil war that had broken out in the Donbass. He was actually quite foolish to be so accommodating to the West. But he's now reached the point where he doesn't trust the West as far as he can throw them. And he's admitted on at least 2 occasions that I know of that he was foolish. He's admitted that he was foolish to have been so trustworthy when it came to dealing with the West.
Yeah, I think he did so here as well. Before I show you the second soundbite from that interview here, I want to interject one from yesterday from Senator Blumenthal, because he goes on to say that, listen, Putin is just a flat-out thug, and the only language he understands is that of force.
The threat of cooperation on that score in sending missile technology to North Korea, as well as support for Iran that potentially could come from Russia, is a major piece of evidence why we need to be strong with our allies against this axis. It still exists. The success against Iran's nuclear program ought not to make us complacent about the dangers of proliferating nuclear arms. And absolutely, yes, we should be coming down stronger, not only on Russia, but North Korea. And our plan has to be to deter this kind of nuclear arms cooperation, which is why our working with our allies is so important.
That was actually not the clip I was thinking of, but that was still a good one there, because you see the mentality that we need to press Russia and that we need to deter them. And this whole axis of evil is real, and it's not just something we made up. What do you make of that?
Well, his comments about Iran are very revealing. He believes that it was successful. He, I guess, hasn't gotten the word that the Israelis now acknowledge that the Iranians escaped the 12-day war with a substantial amount of enriched uranium. And furthermore, almost everybody agrees they have the ability to reconstitute their enrichment capability to the extent that it has been badly damaged by the attacks in the 12-day war. So the idea that force solve the Iran problem is simply wrong. And by the way, we can add to this the whole regime change issue, because one of the goals of that offensive was to effect regime change in Iran, not just to destroy the nuclear enrichment capability. And with regard to both of those goals, we and the Israelis failed. It's just very important to understand that. And the idea that we're going to use force to push Vladimir Putin around and get our way, does he not understand that Vladimir Putin is winning on the battlefield? And as we've discussed here on the show, we do not have any way of reversing the Ukrainians' fortunes on the battlefield. So the idea that we can just get tougher with the Russians and this is going to solve the problem is a pipe dream. And again, to go back to Iran, where are we on Iran? Have we solved that problem? Are we going to live happily ever after? Of course, the answer is no. And this is why everybody's saying that the Iranians better get ready for another attack from the Israelis and probably the United States as well. So all of this emphasis on using force to solve all these problems has not worked out well up to now. And the truth is, it's not going to work out well in the future.
And if anybody is confused on that point, all they got to do is listen to Vladimir Putin, because if all the things that we've done to Russia over the 3.5 years of this war, and really going all the way back to 2014 and the Minsk Accords and everything else like that, actually going all the way back to 1999, which you talked about with the constant movement of NATO to the Russian border, they should be dispelled now, because Putin doesn't seem to be giving in to the pressure.
We proposed a lot in the area of strategic offensive weapons. In the area of everything, everything was rejected, 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 rejected. Well, it became clear that until we declare ourselves as an independent sovereign power, capable of defending its future, they will not reckon with us.
So he seems to be saying the opposite. The more you push, the more we realize we have to get stronger and stronger. How do you see this dynamic playing out?
I think that's exactly right. I think that, one of the first things you learn in Strategy 101 is that when you punch somebody in the face, you have to take into account what they're going to do in terms of retaliation. And a lot of people in the West think only in terms of a first strike. They don't think of the other side's second strike. And what's happened here is we were very tough with the Russians. We paid their interests very little heed up till 2014. And everything that's happened since 2014 has caused the Russians to have even more doubt about our so-called goodwill. And the emphasis is and the fact is that as a result of this, Putin is playing hardball with us. And this is hardly surprising at all. And as we said a few minutes ago, it's surprising that he didn't figure this out sooner. And he chastises himself for not recognizing the need to be tough with the West. But he's in a position now where he can afford to play tough. He's winning the war. And as long as he's winning the war, all of this empty rhetoric of ours is just not going to make much difference. And again, we just don't have anything to do, anything we can do to fix the situation on the battlefield.
So let me ask you in the last few minutes we have here, where does this go next? And I asked that question in light of the fact that Europe is on a rebuild program, some allegedly $800 billion spread over, that NATO itself has said everybody has to get up to 5% GDP, that Mark Rutte just a few days ago emphatically said that, hey, we have to get ready for war with Russia. It could be 3 to 5 to 7 years, and we have to get ready right now, etc. And then this was the Russian media today. They seem to be on the same path, that they're talking about how Europe has begun to prepare for war with Russia, and so that Russia has to prepare for war with them. And the article goes on to continue to say that they also have to get ready. Where do you see this going? Because it doesn't look good to me.
No, I think that the future is remarkably bleak. I find it hard to believe we are where we are. The first thing that has to happen is that this war has to be settled. And as I've said on numerous occasions, I think you're going to get a frozen conflict. You're not going to get a meaningful peace of settlement here. I hope I'm wrong and you do get a meaningful peace settlement, but I don't think that's going to happen. And I think you'll get a frozen conflict. And we have to watch how that plays itself out over the next few months, maybe the next year. And then once we get a frozen conflict, the question you have to ask yourself is, where do we go from there? And if you look around, there's just all sorts of reasons for concern. There's all sorts of trouble in the Baltic these days, where NATO countries are, threatening to intervene with Russian shipping in the Baltic, and the Russians are talking about playing tough with those NATO countries. I mean, there's just so many ways this can spin out of control. And you see all sorts of evidence of Russian analysts talking about the need to maybe use nuclear weapons at some point to convince the West that the Russians are serious. There are a number of Russian strategic analysts who think that the West has forgotten that we live in a nuclear world and that this is a very dangerous world. And maybe the way to remind them of just how dangerous the world is to use nuclear weapons. This is an argument I did not anticipate coming about, but you can find evidence of it. And the people who are making that argument are sophisticated strategists. So you want to remember that if we get tough with the Russians and we push the Russians really hard over the next 5, 6, 10 years, and let's assume that we put the Russians in a situation where they're getting increasingly desperate, they may very well turn to nuclear weapons. Is this likely? No. Is this a plausible scenario? Yes. But you want to compare the situation that we're now in today, after listening to President Trump talk, with the one we would be in if he had been able to shut this war down shortly after he came into office. If he had been able to shut this war down, we would be in much better shape today. Because again, this Ukraine situation is very dangerous at the moment. And as you and I were just saying, it's likely to get more dangerous with the passage of time. So the fact that we are principally responsible for starting this war by initiating the idea of NATO expansion into Ukraine in April of 2008, and the fact that President Trump has been unable to shut this war down, even though he had a real opportunity shortly after he took office, and that we are where we are today, is a thoroughly depressing situation.
Well, it is. And I wish you had a higher note to end on today, but I guess we'll wait and see in the next 50 days, because if there's one thing Trump has shown, and he doesn't stick ideologically to anything. So who knows, maybe in these 50 days, he may come to a different conclusion or maybe get some different information. And there's still the hope until something bad happens that we can have a better outcome, and maybe Trump will find some way to use the leverage he has to bring this war to an end. But in any case, we certainly are grateful for your very clear information on this and your knowledge. Thank you.
My pleasure, Danny.
And always our pleasure too. We are going to be back again on, by the way, we're going to get kind of a Ukraine view on all this with the show. I think it's at 3:00 this afternoon, if I'm not mistaken. Gary, correct me if I'm wrong. Is that the right number? Okay, yeah, it is 3:00. Thanks. It's called The Russian Dude, even though he's actually for the Ukraine side. So you'll see that. That's going to be on our show this afternoon at 3:00. So be sure and tune in then, and we'll see what the other side of this has to say. Thank you very much. We'll see you then on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.